The scent of fresh flowers filled the grand church, mingling with the whispers of anticipation. Candles flickered, casting a warm glow on the faces of the guests, elegantly dressed, waiting for the moment when the bride would walk down the aisle. The orchestra played softly in the background, setting a romantic tone for what was supposed to be a perfect day. Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his fingers trembling slightly. He wasn't nervous about marrying Olivia. He had been waiting for this day for years, dreaming of the life they would build together. But as the minutes ticked by, the anticipation turned into an unsettling tension. Olivia was late. At first, he thought it was a minor delay, perhaps a last-minute touch to her dress or an emotional moment with her mother. But when his best man whispered something into the officiant's ear, the older man's expression stiffened. Then, the murmur of guests grew louder, and Ethan's heart pounded. Something was wrong. A woman approached him hastily, her face tense with worry. It was Mrs. Johnson, Olivia's longtime housekeeper and practically family. In her hands, she held a delicate ivory envelope, the handwriting unmistakable. Ethan's stomach dropped. "She left this for you," Mrs. Johnson said softly, her voice filled with sorrow. He took the envelope, his fingers tightening around it. His name was written in elegant strokes, but the weight of those letters felt heavier than anything he had ever held. The church seemed to blur around him, the flowers, the guests, the whispers, all fading as he unfolded the letter. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I can't marry you. Please don't look for me. I love you. Olivia." The words twisted inside his chest like a knife. He read them again, hoping to find some hidden meaning between the lines, some explanation that would make sense. But all he found was the cruel finality of her decision. His breath turned shallow. He could hear the murmurs turning into gasps as guests realized what had happened. The altar, once a symbol of their future, now felt like a stage for his humiliation. Without another word, Ethan turned on his heel and stormed down the aisle. He had no idea where he was going, only that he had to get away, away from the eyes filled with pity, away from the broken dream of the life he had imagined with her. The rain started as he stepped outside, soaking his suit within seconds. The cold, sharp droplets did nothing to clear the storm raging inside him. He clenched the letter in his fist, the ink smearing under the raindrops. He wanted answers, but Olivia had vanished without a trace. That night, he searched for her. He called her family, her friends, anyone who might know where she had gone, but no one had an answer. Olivia had disappeared as if she had never existed, leaving behind nothing but that single heartbreaking letter. 20 years later, the applause echoed through the grand auditorium as the graduates took their seats. Ethan sat in the audience, barely paying attention to the ceremony. He had been invited by a close friend's son, but his mind wandered, lost in memories he had long tried to bury. Then a name was called: Liam Davenport. Ethan's head snapped up. He hadn't expected the reaction, the sudden chill running through his spine. A young man walked across the stage, tall and poised, with an air of quiet confidence. Something about him struck Ethan in a way he couldn't explain. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. His sharp jawline, the way he carried himself, it was familiar, painfully so. His chest tightened as the young man accepted his diploma, shaking the dean's hand before stepping aside. Ethan felt his hands grip the arms of his seat. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He turned instinctively, scanning the audience, and then there she was, Olivia, sitting a few rows away, her hands clasped tightly together. Her hair was different, a few strands of silver weaving through the once dark locks, but her eyes, the same eyes that had haunted him for years, were unmistakable. His world tilted. The truth crashed over him like a wave, fierce and relentless. The boy on stage wasn't just any graduate. He wasn't just another young man celebrating his future. He was Ethan's son. His breathing turned shallow. He clenched his jaw, fighting against the rush of emotions, rage, disbelief, sorrow. Olivia had lied. She had stolen 20 years from him. Without thinking, Ethan rose from his seat. He pushed past the people blocking his way, ignoring their murmurs, his gaze locked on her. Olivia's face paled when she saw him. She turned away as if she could disappear again, as if she could slip through his fingers like she had before. Not this time. Ethan reached her before she could escape, his voice low but firm. "Is he mine?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with 2 decades of pain. She didn't answer, but she didn't have to. Her silence told him everything. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. The world around him seemed to fade, reduced to a singular focus. The woman who had disappeared from his life, and the truth she had kept from him for 20 years. Olivia took a sharp breath, her fingers tightening around the program in her lap. She looked older, but time hadn't erased the softness in her eyes or the way she held herself with quiet strength. "Ethan," she murmured, barely above a whisper, as if saying his name might unravel everything she had carefully built, but there was no escaping this moment. His jaw clenched. "Answer me, Olivia. Is he mine?" She looked away, blinking rapidly. Her silence only stoked the fire burning inside him. He had spent years questioning, agonizing over why she left, and now, in a single, cruel twist of fate, the truth stood before him in the form of a young man who had grown up without him. Ethan's voice dropped lower, but the force behind it remained. "I deserve to know." Olivia swallowed hard. "Not here," she said quickly, glancing around as if the walls were closing in. Not now. He could see it, panic creeping into her expression, the desperate need to maintain control. But she had lost that right the moment she chose to disappear. He exhaled sharply, pushing back the urge to demand everything right then and there. She was right about one thing. This wasn't the place for a confrontation, but it would happen. Where? His voice was steel. She hesitated for only a moment. "There's a cafe 2 blocks from here." 20 minutes. It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough to make up for the years he had lost, but it was all she was willing to give him for now. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The ceremony blurred into the background as he exited the auditorium. The heat of the late afternoon sun did nothing to thaw the ice settling in his chest. He needed air. He needed to think. He barely noticed the people congratulating the graduates, the laughter, the cheers. How many moments like this had he missed? Birthdays, first steps, late-night talks, his son, a son he had never known. The realization was suffocating. He ran a hand down his face, trying to steady himself before heading to the cafe. When he arrived, Olivia was already there, seated at a table near the window. She looked restless, stirring a cup of coffee she clearly had no intention of drinking. Ethan took a seat across from her, every movement deliberate. "Talk," he said. She sighed, setting the spoon down. Her hands trembled slightly, and for the first time, he saw something deeper in her eyes. Regret. "I was sick, Ethan." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Months before the wedding, I was diagnosed with a serious illness. I didn't know how long I had. The treatments were aggressive, and I felt like I was drowning. I couldn't tell you. I didn't want you to be trapped in a life of pain, watching me deteriorate." His throat tightened, but he said nothing. He let her speak. Then she hesitated, glancing down. "A few months later, I found out I was pregnant." Her voice cracked slightly, as if the memory itself was too much to bear. "The doctors said I might not make it through the pregnancy. I was terrified. I thought I was sentencing a child to life without a mother." And you had a whole future ahead of you. I didn't want you to watch me die." Ethan felt as though the air had been knocked from his lungs. His hands curled into fists under the table. He wanted to be furious, to tell her how unforgivable it was to make that choice for him. But at the same time, he could hear the raw pain in her voice, the weight of what she had carried alone. "Then what?" he asked hoarsely. "I left. I went somewhere quiet, where no one knew me. I was convinced I wouldn't make it, Ethan. Every day I prepared for the worst. But then I survived. I don't know how, but I did. And by the time I realized I wasn't dying, it was too late. Liam was already growing up. You had moved on." His breath hitched. Moved on. As if it had been that easy. As if he hadn't spent years searching for an answer, burying himself in work to silence the ache of losing her. "You had no right," he said, his voice shaking. "No right to keep my son from me." She flinched but held his gaze. "I thought I was doing what was best." Ethan leaned forward, his voice raw with emotion. "And what about what was best for me? For him? You didn't even give me a choice." Silence stretched between them, thick with everything left unsaid. Finally, Olivia exhaled, her shoulders sagging. "I don't expect you to forgive me." He didn't respond. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't know if he ever would. Ethan's fingers pressed into the table, his knuckles white as he stared at the woman who had once been his entire world. The cafe around them buzzed with the quiet hum of conversations, but all he could hear was the weight of her confession still hanging between them. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Olivia had said. The words replayed in his mind, stirring something deep and unresolved. He wasn't ready to answer, not yet. His gaze flickered toward the window, catching his own reflection in the glass. He barely recognized himself. He had spent years building a life, convincing himself he had moved on. Yet here he was, standing at the edge of the past he had buried, realizing that none of it had truly faded. Olivia shifted in her seat, her fingers nervously twisting together. "Ethan, say something." His eyes snapped back to her. "What do you want me to say?" His voice was quiet, but the intensity in it was unmistakable. "That I understand, that I forgive you. You took my son from me, Olivia." She flinched, as if the word struck a nerve. "I was trying to protect you." Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. "You don't get to decide what I needed. You don't get to erase me from his life because you thought it was easier." Her shoulders slumped. "I know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "and I know there's nothing I can say that will make it right." Silence settled between them, heavy and suffocating. Ethan's thoughts were a whirlwind of memories, of the love they had once shared, of the agony of losing her, of the years spent questioning why she had left. And now, the greatest betrayal of all, a son he never knew existed. Finally, he pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. Olivia's eyes widened. "Where are you going?" "To see my son." She stood quickly, reaching for his arm. "Ethan, wait." He pulled away, his jaw tight. No more waiting, no more secrets. Leaving her there, he stepped out into the cool evening air. The world outside felt different now, as if everything had shifted beneath his feet. He didn't know where to start, only that he had to. The next morning, Ethan found himself outside a small bookstore nestled between two brick buildings. It wasn't the kind of place he would normally visit, but Olivia had told him Liam worked there part-time. Through the large window, he spotted him. Liam stood behind the counter, a book in his hands, flipping through the pages absent-mindedly. Up close, the resemblance was even more undeniable. The strong jaw, the way he furrowed his brow in concentration. Ethan took a steadying breath and stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly, and Liam looked up. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. "Can I help you?" Liam asked politely, though there was a flicker of something in his expression. Curiosity, uncertainty. Ethan swallowed hard. Liam. The young man stiffened slightly at the familiarity in his tone. Do I know you? Ethan hesitated, suddenly aware of how impossible this moment was. How did you introduce yourself to the son you never knew you had? He faltered, the words catching in his throat. He had spent all night thinking about what he would say, but now, standing before him, nothing seemed adequate. Liam's eyes narrowed slightly. Who are you? A beat of silence. Then, with quiet determination, Ethan spoke the words that would change everything. I'm your father. Liam stared at him, his expression unreadable. The clock on the wall ticked, the only sound in the room. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a breath, part shock, part disbelief. You're joking. Ethan shook his head. No! Liam took a step back, gripping the edge of the counter as if needing something solid to hold on to. His mind raced, piecing together things that had never quite made sense. The way his mother always dodged questions about his father, the gaps in his childhood that were never explained. He let out a bitter laugh. 20 years, and now you decide to show up? Ethan winced. I didn't know about you. Liam scoffed. And whose fault is that? The question was a punch to the gut. Ethan had no answer, no way to justify the lost time. I wanted to be there, he said, his voice tight with emotion. If I had known, but you didn't. Liam's jaw clenched, the weight of 2 decades of absence pressing down on him. And now what? You think you can just walk in here and what? Be my dad? Ethan looked at him, really looked at him. He was strong, independent, a man who had grown up without him, who had every right to be angry. No, Ethan admitted. But I want to try. Liam studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sharp exhale, he stepped around the counter. I need time, he muttered, brushing past Ethan as he walked toward the door. Ethan didn't stop him. He simply watched as his son, walked away, leaving him standing in the middle of a bookstore filled with stories. Only this one, their story, was just beginning. Ethan sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, staring blankly at the bookstore's entrance. Liam was gone, disappearing into the city streets without looking back. The encounter had lasted only minutes, yet it felt like an entire lifetime had unraveled before him. His son, his flesh and blood, and he had walked away. A part of him wanted to follow, to chase him down and make him listen. But what right did he have? Liam had grown up believing his father didn't exist, and now, out of nowhere, here he was, expecting a conversation to fix what 20 years of absence had built. He exhaled sharply and rubbed a hand down his face. Olivia had stolen time from him, but what mattered now was what he did with the time he had left. The next few days crawled by, heavy with unanswered questions. He wanted to give Liam space, but patience had never been his strongest virtue. Every fiber of his being demanded action. It was late afternoon when he found himself parked outside Olivia's house. He hadn't called. He didn't have to. The moment she opened the door and saw him standing there, she knew why he had come. You saw him, she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. Ethan walked past her, his eyes scanning the cozy but simple home. Photographs lined the shelves, memories he had never been a part of. There were pictures of Liam at different stages of his life. His first birthday, his first day of school, a blurry snapshot of him holding a baseball glove. Ethan stopped in front of a particular frame. It was recent. Liam, wearing his graduation gown, his arm wrapped around Olivia, they both looked happy. His throat tightened. That should have been him standing there. He should have been a part of those moments. I don't know how to fix this, Olivia admitted from behind him. Ethan turned, his expression unreadable. You can't? She nodded, as if she had expected that answer. But maybe he will. Ethan's jaw clenched. He's angry. He has every right to be. She took a step closer. He's confused, Ethan. He spent his whole life believing something that wasn't true. He needs time to process it. Ethan shook his head, frustration bleeding into his voice. I don't have time, Olivia. 20 years is already too long. She hesitated, then sighed. Give him a reason to want to know you. Ethan frowned. And how do I do that? She walked to the kitchen counter and picked up a small notepad, scribbling something quickly before handing it to him. He goes to the lake trail every Sunday morning. He likes to clear his head. Ethan looked down at the address. A chance. That was all he needed. Sunday morning arrived with a crisp breeze rolling over the water. The lake was peaceful, the kind of place that invited solitude. Ethan spotted Liam sitting on a wooden bench overlooking the water, his posture relaxed, yet his expression distant. Ethan approached cautiously, unsure of how to start. Mind if I sit? Liam tensed at the sound of his voice but didn't look at him. After a moment, he shrugged. It's a free country. Ethan lowered himself onto the bench, leaving enough space to give Liam the choice to leave if he wanted to. They sat in silence for a long moment, the sounds of nature filling the air between them. I never wanted to miss your life, Ethan finally said. If I had known. You didn't. Liam cut him off, his tone clipped. That's the point. Ethan exhaled. I know I can't change the past. But I'd like to know you now. Liam scoffed, shaking his head. And what am I supposed to do with that, huh? Just pretend 20 years didn't happen? No, Ethan admitted, but maybe we don't have to let it define the next 20. Liam's fingers curled around his knee, his jaw tightening. I don't know you. Ethan's voice was steady. Then let's change that. Silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't as heavy. Liam ran a hand through his hair, then finally turned to face him for the first time. I don't know what you expect from me. Ethan met his gaze. Nothing. Just a chance. Liam studied him, searching for something. Maybe sincerity, maybe regret. Finally, he exhaled, his expression still guarded but not entirely closed off. I don't promise anything, he said. Ethan allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. That's more than I had yesterday. Liam looked away, but this time, he didn't walk off. For the first time, it felt like the door hadn't just closed, it had cracked open. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the unopened email on his screen. The sender's name was unmistakable, Liam. It had been a week since their quiet conversation by the lake, and while Liam had left without making any promises, this message felt like a small victory. His hands hovered over the keyboard before he finally clicked on it. Subject, I'm not ready, but Dad... He paused, the words striking him harder than he expected. It was the first time Liam had acknowledged him in that way, even if it was just in writing. I don't know what I'm supposed to say. This is weird for me. I spent my whole life thinking I didn't have a father, and now here you are. I'm not mad at you, but I don't know how to feel about any of this. My mother says I should give you a chance, but I don't know if I can. Not yet, but I don't want to pretend you don't exist either. So maybe we start slow. No expectations, no big moments. Just see what happens. Ethan exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. It wasn't a warm embrace, wasn't the immediate acceptance he had hoped for, but it was something. It was a step. He hit reply. Liam, I won't push. You set the pace. I'll be here. Ethan, the days that followed were careful and tentative. They exchanged a few texts, brief, simple conversations about books, movies, things that didn't carry too much weight. It was foreign territory for both of them, but at least they were talking. One afternoon, Ethan received a message from Olivia. Liam's birthday is next Saturday. I thought you should know. His fingers tightened around his phone. 20 birthdays. 20 candles blown out without him there. And now he had a chance to be present. He hesitated before typing back, "Does he want me there?" A few minutes passed before the response came. He didn't say no. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Saturday arrived faster than he expected. He stood outside Olivia's house, holding a simple gift. Nothing extravagant, just something thoughtful. He didn't want to overwhelm Liam, didn't want to make this about what had been lost. When Olivia opened the door, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but she stepped aside, letting him in. The house was filled with warm laughter, the scent of home-cooked food lingering in the air. Liam stood by the kitchen, talking to a friend, his expression relaxed, but the moment he spotted Ethan, something unreadable crossed his face. Their eyes met. Ethan gave him the choice. No pressure, no expectation. Liam could ignore him, walk away, pretend he wasn't there, but he didn't. Instead, after a beat of hesitation, he walked over. "Hey," Liam said, stuffing his hands into his pockets. Ethan nodded, keeping his voice steady. "Happy birthday." Liam glanced at the gift in Ethan's hand, but didn't reach for it. "You didn't have to come." "I know," Ethan replied, "but I wanted to." A pause stretched between them. Then Liam sighed. "You want some cake?" Ethan exhaled, a small, genuine smile breaking through. "Yeah, I'd like that." It wasn't everything, but it was something, and for now, that was enough. Ethan sat in his living room, staring at his phone, rereading the last message from Liam. "Thanks for coming." It was short, simple, but for Ethan, it meant everything. For the first time in 20 years, he felt like he was moving towards something instead of just chasing a ghost. He and Liam weren't father and son in the traditional sense, not yet, but there was a bridge now, fragile and unsteady, waiting to be crossed. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He frowned, not expecting anyone, and when he opened it, his breath hitched. Olivia. She stood there, arms crossed, her expression guarded. She had barely looked him in the eyes at Liam's birthday, keeping her distance. But now, standing on his doorstep, there was something different in her gaze. "Can I come in?" she asked. Ethan stepped aside, letting her pass. She took a few hesitant steps into the room, her eyes scanning the space as if she were stepping into his world for the first time. "You still like things neat," she murmured, glancing at the perfectly arranged bookshelves. Ethan crossed his arms. "Old habits." A silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. She finally sighed. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For being patient with him," she said. "For not pushing too hard." Ethan studied her, searching for something deeper behind the words. "I meant what I said. I'm letting him set the pace." She nodded, but her fingers fidgeted, betraying her nerves. "You know, when I left, I convinced myself that I was doing the right thing, that I was protecting both of you." She let out a bitter chuckle. "But the truth is, I was scared. I didn't know how to face everything. And then, when I realized I was going to survive, it was too late. I had already built this lie, and I didn't know how to undo it." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had spent years carrying anger toward her, believing she had chosen to abandon him, but hearing her now, seeing the way regret settled in her eyes, complicated everything. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," he admitted. "But I don't hate you anymore." Her lips parted slightly, as if those words had caught her off guard. For a long moment, she simply nodded, absorbing them. "I guess that's something," she said softly. Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't want to live in the past, Olivia, but I also can't pretend it didn't happen." "I don't expect you to," she said, "but maybe we can find a way to move forward. For Liam." Ethan met her gaze. He saw the same woman he had once loved, the woman who had broken him, but who had also carried a pain of her own. "We'll figure it out," he said. It wasn't a promise of forgiveness. It wasn't a declaration of second chances, but it was a start. A week later, Ethan and Liam met for coffee. It was their first real outing, and Ethan made sure to keep things light, asking about his classes, his favorite books, the places he liked to go. Liam was still guarded, but there were moments, brief, flickering seconds, where he let his guard down, where his laughter came easy, and Ethan held onto those moments, knowing they were the foundation of something stronger. As they finished their drinks, Liam hesitated, as if debating something. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. "I found this," he said, sliding it across the table. Ethan picked it up. It was an old picture, grainy, slightly faded but instantly recognizable. A younger version of himself, standing next to Olivia. She was wearing a summer dress, smiling at him, unaware that the future would tear them apart. "I guess I just wanted to know what you were like back then," Liam admitted. "Before everything." Ethan looked at him, something swelling in his chest. "I was happy," he said truthfully, "because I had her. Because I thought we'd have forever." Liam nodded slowly, then leaned back in his chair. "Maybe one day you can tell me more?" Ethan smiled, setting the photograph down between them. "I'd like that." The late afternoon sun cast golden streaks across the sky as Ethan sat on a park bench, sipping his coffee. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves, and for the first time in a long while he felt a sense of peace, not certainty, not resolution, but something close enough. He heard footsteps approaching and turned his head just as Liam sat down beside him, a book tucked under his arm. They didn't need an invitation anymore. The unspoken understanding between them had become enough. For a few moments, they sat in comfortable silence, watching a family nearby, two kids chasing each other while their father pretended to be a slow, lumbering monster. Ethan glanced at Liam, wondering if he ever thought about what could have been, if he ever imagined a childhood with him in it, but he didn't ask. Some questions didn't need answers. Liam broke the silence first. "You know, I've been thinking." Ethan raised a brow, waiting. Liam exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know what a father-son relationship is supposed to look like, and honestly, I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about all of this." He paused, his fingers drumming lightly against the book's spine. "But I don't hate having you around." A slow smile tugged at Ethan's lips. "That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." Liam chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't get used to it." Ethan nodded, accepting the moment for what it was. He didn't need grand declarations, didn't need years of lost time to be rewritten overnight. Liam was here. That was enough. After a while, Liam stood, adjusting the strap of his bag. "I'll see you next week." Ethan looked up at him, holding his gaze. "Yeah, next week." Liam gave a small nod before walking away, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. The wind rustled through the trees, scattering leaves at his feet. He picked one up absent-mindedly, turning it between his fingers. He had spent so many years looking back, drowning in the weight of what had been lost. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to start looking forward. What would you have done in Ethan's place? Like, subscribe and share. Help me grow.